The town square lay quiet under the pale weight of morning, though the silence was not the kind that brings peace. It was the kind that waits, the kind that grows heavy before a storm. Dust rolled low across the boards of the street, clinging to boots and skirts, rising in soft clouds with each step. The buildings leaned like weary sentinels, their windows staring blank and unkind. Men gathered in clusters, hats pulled low, voices low and mean. They waited not for law or sermon, but for the sound of bidding. At the center of that crowd, a rough wooden platform stood, as if built for cruelty itself. Its planks were stained with old reigns and older sins, and upon it, pressed forward like cattle, stood a woman no older than 22, her wrists trembling though she held them tight against her dress, as though gripping dignity with all her strength. Her hair fell long and black over her shoulders, tangled from wind and dust, and her face, though marked with exhaustion, carried a beauty that not even hardship could bury. She was foreign in their eyes, too foreign to be given kindness, yet not foreign enough to be ignored. At her side clung a child, no more than 7, barefoot, with her dress torn at the hem. She pressed her face into her mother's skirt, though her eyes, wide, dark, unblinking, peered out at the sea of men who measured her with the same gaze they gave the mule tethered nearby. When rough hands tried to separate her from her mother, the girl's small voice rose above the murmurs. It was not loud, yet it carried through the square, thin as wind through brittle grass. "I swear I won't cry, just don't let them sell my mama." The words were a knife through the stillness. Men shifted on their boots, some scoffing, some spitting into the dirt, others pretending they had not heard. The woman bent low, holding the girl close, whispering comfort she did not believe herself. She could not protect her daughter from the truth, that the world had already decided their worth. On the edge of that crowd stood a man who had not planned to linger. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, his coat heavy with dust, his face carved by years of silence. 30 winters had hardened him, not with cruelty but with a quiet sort of detachment. He was the kind of man who passed through towns like smoke, seen, then gone, leaving nothing behind. Yet when the girl's plea cracked open the air, he did not turn away. Something in the shape of her trembling, something in the desperate grip of her hands on her mother's dress, called back a memory he had buried so deep it still hurt to breathe. The auctioneer barked words, his voice thick, his gestures impatient. He announced the woman as though she were nothing more than a parcel, a burden someone might as well take for coin. Men jeered, numbers flew. A hand lifted from the crowd, then another, bids rising, laughter sour. The woman stood rigid, eyes fixed somewhere beyond them all, a place where shame could not reach her. The girl clung tighter, her small fingers digging into the fabric of her mother's skirt until her knuckles turned white. And then she was yanked. The girl's body lifted, thrown to the ground, her knees striking dirt. She looked up, tears brimming though she held them back as promised. Her lip quivered, but her voice did not break. She whispered it again, almost to herself this time, "Don't let them take her." Boots sounded against the planks. A hush followed. The man in the dark coat stepped forward through the crowd, his presence unannounced but undeniable. He did not shout, nor did he argue. He simply placed a heavy pouch of silver coins upon the block. The auctioneer faltered, blinking at the weight, then counted it with greedy hands. The laughter stopped. The mutters grew. The man did not look at them. His gaze, steady and unreadable, rested only on the woman and the child. Papers were shoved toward him, ink and signatures demanded. He ignored them, his silence saying what words could not. When the last coin was pocketed and the crowd began to disperse with sour disappointment, the man simply turned and walked away. The woman stood frozen, the girl clinging to her leg. For a moment it seemed neither dared to believe they were free of the stage, free of the eyes that measured them like livestock. Then the girl tugged at her mother's hand, and the woman followed where the cowboy led. They walked past faces twisted with resentment, past muttered curses that accused him of weakness, of waste, of foolery. He did not answer. His boots pressed dust into the ground, steady as if this had been his road all along. The child's steps were quick and stumbling, yet she did not cry. She held her mother's hand tight, glancing up now and again at the man who walked beside them. Her gaze was not filled with trust, not yet, but with something deeper, a fragile, trembling hope. Behind them, the town returned to its noise, its trade, its cruel indifference. The platform remained, empty now, waiting for the next set of lives to be weighed and sold. But for this woman and her daughter, something had shifted. Their chains had not been broken by mercy nor by justice, but by the quiet defiance of a stranger who could not bear the sound of a little girl begging for her mother. And so the three of them passed beyond the edge of the square, where the dust of the town gave way to the long and lonely road. The sun climbed higher, its light stretching across the plain. The girl's hand tightened in her mother's, her small chest rising and falling with the effort of keeping tears at bay. She had sworn she would not cry. For now, she kept her promise. But in her silence, as the man led them away from the crowd, she allowed herself one glance back. She saw the stage, the boards that had almost swallowed her life whole. And she knew, though she was too young to put it into words, that something had shifted forever. A stranger had stepped forward, and their story had begun again. The road stretched out before them like a ribbon of dust and silence, winding into the pale distance where sky touched earth in a haze. The man rode first, his horse steady beneath him, its hooves striking a rhythm against the hard ground. Behind, the woman sat astride a mule he had offered, the child nestled close against her, arms wrapped tight around her waist. Neither spoke. The silence between them was not empty but heavy, as though each carried a weight too large for words. The woman's eyes wandered to the land around them, fields dry and brittle, fences broken and leaning, trees scattered thin against the horizon. She thought of her old life, the brief sweetness of it before the world had turned harsh. She had once belonged to someone who saw her as more than a burden. He had died in the dust and smoke of rail lines, leaving her at the mercy of a father-in-law who measured worth only in what a woman could bear or barter. She had been bartered away, her daughter watching. That memory pressed itself against her ribs, sharp as a thorn. The little girl stirred, lifting her head, her hair brushing her mother's chin. She peered at the cowboy ahead, his back rigid, his shoulders broad beneath the worn fabric of his coat. "Why did he do it?" she whispered, her voice so soft it might have been the wind. The woman pressed her lips to her daughter's hair, shushing her gently, though she wondered the same thing. A man like him had no reason to step into their ruin. Men turned away, always. Yet he had not. The cowboy's silence was not cruel but unreadable. He seemed a man who had long ago traded words for endurance. His gaze was fixed ahead, scanning the horizon as though expecting some shadow to appear. When night came, he led them off the road to a hollow where dry grass rose tall. He gathered wood and coaxed fire from stone. Flames leapt, painting his face in a glow that revealed neither softness nor hardness, only weariness. The girl nestled close to her mother, whispering questions into the folds of her dress. "Are we safe now? Will they come after us?" The woman smoothed her daughter's hair, though her heart could not answer with certainty. The cowboy laid no promises upon the air, only kept watch beyond the firelight, his rifle across his knees, his eyes never still. His silence was promise enough. At dawn the sky was bruised with violet and ash, clouds dragging low. The road grew harsher. The mule faltered. The girl shivered though the air was not yet cold. When the sun broke, harsh and blinding, the cowboy slowed his horse and drew from his pack a canteen. Without a word he handed it back. The woman took it, her fingers brushing his glove for the briefest moment, and she realized he had not yet drunk himself. She offered it first to her daughter, and the girl's lips pressed to the metal, eyes fluttering shut as if water alone was salvation. The cowboy gave a small nod, almost unnoticeable, before turning back to the road. The woman studied him then, this stranger who gave without speech. His face bore lines of solitude, not age but wear, as though he had endured more winters than his years could hold. She saw a scar above his brow, faint but deep, the kind that marked a past he did not share. She wondered if he, too, had once begged the world for something it would not give. As days stretched, the silence between them shifted. The girl filled it with her humming, soft tunes carried from her mother's lips. Sometimes she asked the cowboy simple things: what the name of a flower was, how far the road might go. He never answered with stories, only with brief gestures, pointing to the horizon or offering a name in a voice that sounded rough, unused. Yet each answer seemed to steady the girl, and she grew bolder, riding her mule with a kind of fragile pride. One evening, clouds burst. Rain swept across the land, sudden and merciless. They found shelter beneath a rocky ledge, the storm hammering down like drums upon the earth. The woman wrapped her daughter in her shawl, but it was not enough. Without a word the cowboy shrugged from his own coat, heavy and soaked, and draped it around them. The woman met his gaze then, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. He did not look away, though the rain streaked down his face. His jaw clenched as though he bore not just the storm but something larger, older. The girl's breathing steadied beneath the coat, her eyes drifting shut, and for a brief moment the woman allowed herself to feel the warmth of the man's gift, the weight of his silence not as burden but as shelter. She whispered her thanks, unsure if he heard beneath the thunder. By the time the storm eased, the world smelled of earth and ash, the sky torn open to reveal faint stars. They remained awake longer than needed, the fire between them faint but alive. The cowboy tended it carefully, feeding it piece by piece, as though he understood the importance of small, steady gestures. The woman watched him, realizing he had given them more than coin. He had given them space to breathe. When the road carried them through a small settlement days later, the woman felt eyes on her again. Whispers trailed after them. A cowboy with a foreign woman, a child with dark hair and bare feet. Such things stirred both curiosity and disdain. She braced herself for him to step aside, to let her bear the shame alone. But he did not. When men muttered beneath their breath, he walked at her side, steady as a wall. One even spat near her feet, calling her what she had been called too many times before. The cowboy's hand tightened near his holster, though he did not draw. His silence was warning enough, and the crowd melted back. That night the woman could not sleep. She sat near the fire, her daughter curled against her. She turned to the cowboy at last, voice low but clear. "I do not expect a place in this land." She expected no answer, for what could he say? Yet he lifted his gaze from the flames, his voice rough but certain. "Maybe not in the land, but in someone's heart." The words struck her still. Not sweet, not romantic, but steady, like the ground itself. She felt a tremor inside her chest, something like fear, something like hope. She looked at him, but he had already turned back to the fire, as though he had not said anything at all. The girl shifted in her sleep, murmuring softly, her small hand reaching for her mother's. The woman took it, holding tight. Above them, stars spread wide across the dark, indifferent and eternal. Yet here, by a modest fire, something fragile had begun to grow, quiet, steady, and real. Mist clung low to the valley as morning unfolded, wrapping the pines in a veil of silver. The path they followed bent upward toward a small clearing where a cabin stood, its roof bowed but sturdy, its walls dark with age. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney. It was a place that had lived in silence far too long. The cowboy dismounted without a word, tying his horse to the rail. He pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and the smell of dust and emptiness drifted out to meet them. For the woman and her daughter, it was no palace, but it was four walls against the world, and it was more than either dared hope for. The little girl's steps were hesitant as she entered. Her hand trailed along the rough wood, tracing the grain as if testing whether the house might push her away. She glanced at her mother, then at the cowboy, and finally offered a smile, a fragile, cautious smile that suggested she was already imagining what laughter might sound like here. The woman set down the small bundle of belongings they carried, eyes roaming the dim corners. There was nothing but a table, 2 chairs, and a bed stripped bare. Yet she felt something stirring, a space, though empty, that might hold the shape of a future. The cowboy moved with purpose, laying his rifle against the wall, gathering kindling for the hearth. He lit a fire, and at once the air shifted, the flames casting warmth against the shadows. He left them no grand welcome, only the gift of comfort, and somehow that was more powerful than any words. Days began to stretch into rhythm. The woman cleaned with quiet diligence, sweeping dust from the floorboards, airing blankets, mending what she found frayed. She moved as though restoring the cabin restored her as well. The child filled the silence with play, chasing chickens that wandered the yard, laughing for the first time since they had left the town. Her laughter startled the cowboy, his head lifting each time as though he had forgotten such a sound could exist. The cowboy worked outside, chopping wood, mending the fence, carrying water from the creek. Yet his eyes often lingered on the cabin, on the faint curl of smoke from its chimney, on the shapes moving inside. It was not the first time he had returned here, but it was the first time the place felt less like a hollow and more like something alive. In the evenings, they gathered near the hearth. The girl would fall asleep curled on a blanket, the woman's hand resting protectively against her back. The cowboy would sit across the room, sharpening his knife or whittling scraps of wood into small shapes. One night he placed one of those carvings on the table, a tiny bird, rough but careful. The girl woke, saw it, and squealed with delight. She carried it in her small hands, showing it to her mother. The woman looked at the carving, then at him, and her eyes softened in a way that made the air feel warmer. As weeks passed, the silence between the woman and the cowboy began to change. It no longer carried only the weight of things unsaid, it carried understanding. She noticed how he always took the smaller share of food, how he waited until both she and her daughter had eaten before lifting his own fork. She saw how he checked the locks twice each night, as if promising through action what he would not speak aloud. "You are safe here." She, in turn, offered him something just as wordless. She hummed while she worked, soft tunes from her childhood, and sometimes he paused in his chores to listen. She patched his torn sleeve, her fingers careful, and though he muttered that it was not needed, he wore it without protest. Yet the world beyond their clearing was not blind. Whispers spread from the settlement. A man keeping company with a woman cast off by her own kind, raising a child that did not belong to him. It stirred gossip, stirred resentment. Some said he would be ruined, others that she would bring nothing but shame. One evening a pair of men rode up, their voices sharp, their words cutting. They mocked, they hinted at taking her back. The cowboy stood in the doorway, rifle at his side, his eyes steady. He said nothing more than once, but the weight of his voice was iron. The men laughed uneasily and rode on, but their threat lingered in the air like smoke. That night, fear returned to the woman's chest. She held her daughter close, watching the flames crackle. The girl looked to the cowboy, her voice small, asking if they would be sent away. The cowboy crouched before her, his scarred hands resting on his knees. "Not while I still breathe," he said. It was the first promise he had spoken aloud, and it broke something open in the girl. For the first time since she had begged in that square, tears spilled down her cheeks, though she smiled through them. She leaned into him, trusting where once she only hoped. The woman watched, her heart caught between gratitude and fear of believing too deeply. She had been discarded before, treated as a burden, a transaction, a mistake. Yet here was a man who gave without condition, who carried no judgment in his silence. She wondered what it would mean to accept such a gift, and whether the world would allow it. The days grew colder, the nights longer. Yet within the cabin, warmth gathered not just from fire but from something deeper. The girl laughed more freely, the woman hummed louder, and the cowboy, though still a man of few words, let his eyes rest on them longer each night. Something fragile had rooted itself in that soil, fragile but undeniable. Still, the memory of the men's laughter lingered. The world outside had not finished with them. The woman felt it in her bones, the way the wind carried unease, the way shadows seemed to stretch longer across the clearing. She wanted to believe they had found a corner of peace, but peace was rarely left untouched. And so Section 3 closes not in triumph, but in the tender uncertainty of a family just beginning to take shape, aware that their bond had become both their strength and their greatest vulnerability. The cabin was no longer silent, but the silence beyond the trees promised that someone, someday soon, would try to take it all away. The morning broke with a strange stillness, the kind that presses down on the chest and warns of something waiting. Frost clung to the grass outside the cabin, glittering in the pale light, but the air was heavy, uneasy. The cowboy stood at the window, shoulders squared, eyes searching the tree line. He had known this peace was borrowed. Whispers in the settlement had grown sharper, their envy and anger fermenting like rot. Now the rot had found its way to his door. The woman sensed it too. She moved quietly through the cabin, laying her daughter's blanket more tightly around her small shoulders. The child stirred but did not wake. The woman's own heart beat like a drum, low and constant, telling her that the life they had begun to build could be torn apart in a moment. She looked at the cowboy and found his gaze already on her. No words passed, yet she understood. They would not run. By midday the sound came. Hooves striking hard earth, many of them, a rhythm that rolled like thunder down the valley. The girl woke with a start, clutching at her mother's skirt. The cowboy moved with calm precision, checking the rifle, laying pistols where his hands could reach them. His silence steadied the room, though the storm outside grew closer. The riders appeared at the edge of the clearing, 7, maybe 8, their figures dark against the snow-patched hills. They carried rifles, ropes, hard faces set in lines of disdain. Their leader called out, his voice cutting through the cold air. He spoke of debts unpaid, of women who did not belong, of children who would grow like weeds in good soil. His words carried the weight of threat disguised as righteousness. The woman stood behind the cowboy, her daughter pressed against her legs. Every cruel syllable sliced through her, but she held her chin high, unwilling to let them see her bend. The cowboy did not answer at once. He stepped onto the porch, rifle in his hands, his stance rooted like an oak. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, unhurried, a blade dulled by no fear. She stays. The child stays. This is the end of it. The men laughed, harsh and mocking. One raised his rifle, not yet firing but daring. The standoff stretched, each heartbeat longer than the last. Then the first shot cracked the silence, splintering wood near the cabin door. The girl shrieked, muffling the sound against her mother's dress. The cowboy fired back, his shot clean, driving one man from the saddle. The clearing erupted into chaos. Gunfire echoed, smoke curling into the winter air. The woman pulled her daughter to the floor, shielding her with her body, yet her eyes never left the man at the door. He moved with grim certainty, reloading, firing, keeping the enemy at bay. Each pull of the trigger was not for himself but for them, for the promise he had spoken to a child who begged not to be left alone. The settlers pressed harder, circling, their voices filled with curses. A bullet grazed the cowboy's shoulder, blood staining his sleeve. He staggered but did not fall. The woman's fear surged, yet she rose, hands shaking, gathering spent cartridges, pressing them into his grasp. He did not look at her, but their closeness bound them, her courage feeding his strength shielding her courage. One man forced his way through the door, rope in hand, eyes set on the woman. She froze, holding her daughter tighter, ready for pain. But before the rope could fall, the child broke free, standing small but unyielding before her mother. "Don't take her," she cried, her voice fierce though trembling. The words, once whispered in a dusty square, now rang like thunder in the cabin. The man faltered just long enough. The cowboy's shot struck true, sending him sprawling. Silence followed, sharp and sudden. The remaining men cursed, dragging their wounded, retreating into the trees. Their threats echoed as they vanished, promising return, promising vengeance. Yet the clearing stood empty again, save for the smoke and the smell of powder. The cowboy lowered his rifle, his chest heaving. Blood seeped from his shoulder, dark against the fabric. He swayed, catching himself on the doorframe. The woman rushed to him, her hands steady despite their trembling. She pressed cloth against his wound, her forehead brushing his as she whispered words half in prayer, half in gratitude. "You did not just save us. You gave us back our lives." He closed his eyes at her touch, not from weakness but from the weight of what had passed. The girl pressed close, her small hands gripping his coat, her tears wet against him. For the first time, she allowed herself to cry, not from fear but from the relief of knowing he had kept his promise. Days passed in recovery. The cabin bore scars of bullet holes, the yard still held the marks of hooves, yet life returned slowly. The woman tended his wounds with quiet devotion. The girl brought him water, tucked wildflowers into his pocket as though healing him with color. The cowboy bore it all with the same silence, though his eyes softened when they looked at him now, not as a savior but as family. Spring crept into the valley, melting snow into streams, carrying the land from gray into green. The cabin no longer felt like a hollow against the wilderness. It breathed with laughter, with work, with warmth. The little girl ran in the yard, her bird carving clutched tight, her laughter stitching itself into the air. The woman stood at the doorway, watching her child, her gaze drifting often to the man who split wood with one arm while the other still healed. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, the woman stepped to his side. She placed her hand lightly against his uninjured arm. He turned, his face quiet, as always, but in his eyes rested a depth she had longed for and feared to trust. She did not speak of love, for it needed no naming. She spoke instead of belonging, of how the world had told her she would never have a place, and yet here she stood, in the shelter of a man who saw her not as burden, not as foreign, but as brave. He said little, only bent his head slightly, as if agreeing not with words but with the truth they both now carried. The girl ran to them, breathless from play, pressing her small hands into both theirs, binding them together without ceremony. In that moment the world's cruelty fell away, and what remained was the quiet triumph of a family born not of blood but of choice. And so their story closed not with grandeur but with steadiness, the kind that endures storms. The West could remain harsh, men could remain cruel, but nothing could silence the voice of a child who once begged the world not to take her mother. Nothing could undo the bond forged by a man who could not walk away from that plea. For in a land built on dust and loss they had found something rare. They had found one another, and that was enough.